All right. Thank you all so much for your patience. And thank you for joining us here in theCUBE for our panel on AI and data governance. Please join me in welcoming moderator Dr. Leanna House and panelist Zeb Bowden. Bowden? Bowden?
I'll go by it.
Bowden or Bowden. And Eleni Kalivas and David Raymond to the stage. Thank you.
Yes. Is this on? It is. We've certainly experienced and learned more about how AI and data are really transforming our world, right? And it's coming to a point where we can do so much good, but there's also a lot of potential to do so much harm, right? So this particular session is really about the roles by which data is taken into consideration within their agencies and the roles by which they go for trying to govern how it's used or when it's used or whatever the case may be to try to protect and develop trustworthy AI. So thank you so much for coming. Very grateful to have you here. With that, my first question is going to ask them to introduce themselves, but also think hard about the ways by which governance is important to them. In other words, there's so many details and so many aspects when we think about protecting those who are consuming our AI and our development of AI, and different agencies and different groups are going to have different things that they're going to prioritize when developing their roles in governance. So with that, I would like to ask you to first introduce yourself. In your respective roles, summarize how you use or support the use of AI and data in your work, and what are your driving motivations to establish AI and data governance? And yes, Eleni, we'll start with you.
All right. So my name's Eleni Kalivas. I'm a PharmD MBA in healthcare. So managing consultant, I work on the strategy within healthcare, but then also clinical operations. And within that and across that kind of range is technology enablement throughout. So for me, I think governance comes into play when we're thinking of how health systems are structured right now, how they view IT, technology, information systems. And when we're thinking about AI, we really have to pair kind of where is the industry going from an approval, how are we regulatory, like what are the regulatory considerations that we need to consider if we have an agent or if we have a solution that we want to implement, has it been trained on data and what data has it been trained on? So I think governance comes down to that vendor selection, the scale that it could provide for you, the solutions, the patients that you're hoping that it would kind of help with, or back office functions. So we heard about agentic AI, and I think there's definitely a role for that within healthcare as well. So I would say that that's mostly just the construct of how executives are going to change the context in which they lead, because I think that'll be essential in healthcare specifically. We can no longer have our sub-departments and sub-specializations. We need to have more cross-functional teams to actually implement and assess those solutions as they get implemented in health systems.
So my name is Zeb Bowden. I'm a division director at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute right here in Blacksburg. And my job is a little bit unique in this space, I think, because I really straddle the operational side and the research side, every day, and that makes for a very interesting and sometimes stressful, but interesting day nonetheless. So we house over 10 petabytes of transportation data, and which is a very it's kind of a. Some people say that data is the new gold in the AI world. But that's a lot. That's a lot. And we've collected it for over a period of a number of years. We have millions of miles of driving data and thousands of hours. And it can be used for good, and we really want that to happen. And we build systems to collect the data, and we set up infrastructure to store and manage it effectively. And so a big part of that is data governance. And I think we have gotten pretty good at managing the data that we have for our particular use case. But I can say as we've gotten good at that, other folks have asked us to help try to apply our methods and things in other environments. And I can tell you, one of the reasons we're good at it is because we have a very narrow focus. The broader that focus becomes, the harder governance becomes, in my experience anyway. I think there's a lot of frameworks that are very helpful and very effective, but there's also a lot of work. No matter the framework's not going to do the work for you. There's a lot of work that's going to go into it, and the kind of AI push has only served to accelerate that. And so we've got a lot of capabilities to do good things, but we've really got to stick to the fundamentals of making sure that we manage and protect that data according to its intended purpose for the intended and authorized users of those data.
So my name is David Raymond. I'm Virginia Tech's Associate Vice President for Security and Identity. And so in that role, I'm shepherding the university's cybersecurity program across Virginia Tech. And then I'm also responsible for identity and access management. So that's how you log into systems, and then once you log in, what you have access to on those systems. So those are obviously very tightly interconnected. Yeah, and from an IT security perspective, we really view generative AI and other AI systems as software systems, right? That's what they are. That's how we interact with them. We almost always are working with a third-party vendor, right? So we create very few of these software systems ourselves. There are third parties who are creating these software systems, and as with any third-party software vendor, we work with the vendor to make sure that their software programs meet our IT security requirements before we make a purchase. So from a strictly IT security perspective, frankly, we treat AI like we treat any other software. It's a system that has to protect our data in a certain way, and we have processes for that. From a data governance perspective, we take a very data-centric view of IT security at Virginia Tech, right? So we identify high, medium, and low-risk data, and those have very specific definitions, right? If it's student data, if it's health data, if it's PII, if it's financial data, those are all high-risk kinds of things. If it's certain kinds of research data, a lot of those are moderate risk, and then the low risk is just the data that we use to do our everyday jobs. So we classify data according to the level of risk, and then we classify systems based on the data that they consume, right? So we classify IT systems as high, medium, high, moderate, or low risk. And we do the same thing with AI systems, right? So we identify whether it's a local system or a third-party system. We identify the kind of data that it consumes, the risk level of the data, and then from there it's an education problem, and that's where the data governance comes in, right? We need to make sure that users of these systems understand what kinds of data they can apply on these various systems. So we don't want a faculty member, for example, to upload their grades into a freely available commercial ChatGPT, for example, because that's Virginia Tech student data that is being uploaded into a system that's not approved for high-risk data management. And it's not always easy to identify which of those systems are appropriate for which kinds of data, right? So it's it all becomes a governance and an education problem to make sure that users of those systems understand how they can be used, what data can be used with them. And then if you think of researchers, so up until middle of last week, I was the interim associate vice president for research computing, and we have systems on which people can train AI models, right? We have GPU clusters as part of our high performance computing environments, and we have similar data issues with researchers doing AI research, right? If you're building an AI model, you have to first understand the level of risk of the data that you're using to train that model. If it's high-risk data, there are only certain systems that you can use to train those models. And then you also have to be thinking about intellectual property. So whose intellectual property is it that you're uploading into this model? Is it yours? Is it the university's? Is it externally licensed intellectual property? All those things come into consideration. It's obviously not an easy problem to solve. If it was easy, then ChatGPT and OpenAI and other companies would have solved this already. They're all facing lawsuits along these lines. But we're out to protect the university, and so those are the kinds of things that we're concerned with, I think, from an AI and governance perspective.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, you all had overlapping purposes for the governance, but I just would like to highlight some themes, right? So Eleni mentioned the idea of having multiple departments or multiple disciplines to evaluate and assess, right? So it's not just one isolated department, but in a group of departments that are evaluating and assessing. Zeb had mentioned the idea of making sure that the data are used as intended, right? That the processing and the managing of the ginormous data set that they have is really stored in a way that's accessible, as well as, again, used as intended. And then David really spoke to the fact of the security and making sure that we maintain individuals' privacies, whether your intellectual property or your own personal identity. All three of them, I'm sure, require and have to make sure that they oversee those elements to govern their data and govern the models that they're creating. But all three of them also highlighted those particular pieces to the puzzle for their use. So thank you so much. I failed to mention that now I'd like to ask them individual questions, and if time allows, that then we will then open it up to see if there's any other questions in the audience. And of course, there's a backup question just in case. All right, so with that, in no particular order, we'll start with you, Zeb, if you don't mind. The Virginia Tech Traffic Institute, the VTTI, right, manages a large portfolio of research projects, some of which pertain to autonomous vehicles. As autonomous vehicles become more prevalent, what ethical considerations need to be addressed to ensure public safety and trust?
So if we think about autonomous vehicles from an AI standpoint, or even from just a scientific algorithm development standpoint, it's very important, I think, that we have the appropriate data to train these models in the environments that the vehicles are going to be operating on. So, and I think there has been, at least in the United States, there has been a concerted effort to make sure that the data that we're using for these models and the data that we're collecting for these models is representative of what we're trying to be, the entire United States roadway system, instead of just maybe the affluent areas that typically might have these vehicles first, but that we're building the systems in a way that they will work and potentially benefit everybody. Because one of the key arguments for these systems eventually, and whether you believe this or not, I have some skepticism too, but one of the key arguments for these types of systems is that they will save lives. And so we want to make sure that we have collected the appropriate data, the necessary data, to save lives in all areas, not just the affluent areas. And then for those, I don't know if any of you were in the last session, but they did bring up this notion of adversarial AI. And that's a big concern in kind of the autonomous and even advanced technology space within vehicles. So if you haven't seen it, it's worth Googling, what you can do with some chewing gum and a stop sign, and how easy it is to confuse at least some of the first generation models of this, and computer vision models in general. So I think that's not Virginia Tech's problem to solve per se. That's something that everybody who's working on these vehicles in the civilian space, the military space, drone space, any real cyber physical system is, I think, and certainly needs to be concerned with.
Interesting. Thank you so much. The next question is for David Raymond. You were just appointed the Associate Vice President of Security and Identity at Virginia Tech. What steps is Virginia Tech taking to educate students? You had mentioned that this was a critical component, right? Students, faculty, and staff about the importance of AI and data governance and security. What successes have you had, and what challenges are you facing?
Yeah, so from a training perspective, from an awareness perspective, as a security guy, I think of it as basic security awareness training, right? Again, it comes back to the data that's being used and basic security awareness. I'm sure it's not surprising to know that about 75% of our data breaches can be traced directly back to a user who did something wrong, right? They read a phishing email and clicked on a link, or they configured something incorrectly. And so in the security awareness space, we have a basic level of security awareness that everyone has to have. And then for specific populations, like system administrators or people who manage particular data sets, they have specific tailored training for those different roles. And when we think about AI awareness, I think it's the same thing, right? So we have a basic level of AI awareness that everyone has to have. And then we have some specific awareness training that we need to do with some certain populations. And so I've been co-chairing a university AI working group since April. We started this effort back when I was still working in research computing. And my co-chair is Dale Pike, who runs TLOS, our technology enhanced learning and online strategies, which is tools for teaching and learning. And So there's a variety of different components of the charge of that group. One of them is to define guidelines for the ethical and responsible use of AI at Virginia Tech, right? So pretty soon you'll see on a website, ai.vt.edu, you'll have guidelines for responsible use, and there'll be an overarching set of guidelines, and then you'll see some specific guidelines for 3 different populations. That's the administrative folks, so people who are doing like HR and facilities and administrative operations, finance, those kinds of things. Then there'll be a set of guidelines for researchers, right? There's a whole different set of things that researchers need to be thinking about. And then there's a different set of guidelines for teaching and learning, right, for the education space. And fortunately, we have some partners at the university who are helping us with some of those training programs. You know, the Division of IT is really responsible for the security awareness part. We have some friends in the library who are building some basic AI awareness training for university-wide consumption. And then they'll also do some work on the research side. We have some friends in TELOS, again, Technology Enhanced Learning and Online Strategies. They're working on AI guidelines and awareness for teaching and learning. In fact, the TELOS website right now has some pretty good resources for faculty to use in the classroom. And then in research, we have some partners in the Office of Research and Innovation, along with OESRC, our government research compliance office. They are focused on the research space. So I think it's a team effort. There's a lot of different populations that we need to make sure are aware in different ways, and you'll see this evolve over the next several months.
Excellent. I do have a follow-up question for you in terms of earlier you said you really commented a lot about the security of the individuals and their individual identities and such. Would you say that that's the primary focus of the education when you say that there's a basic awareness? Because there's so many complexities to AI, whether it's use out of context or misuse of the data that were originally put into it, as in the data are not used as intended, right? And then there's the element of if there's personal information and the security of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the individual security awareness is about securing our own data, but it's also about understanding how university data can be used in different contexts.
Okay.
And that, again, that's going to be based on a person's role at the university. Some folks don't have access to what we would consider to be moderate or high risk university data. Lots of people do, and they need to have basic understanding of where they can use it.
Gotcha. I understand. Thank you. Eleni, Kalivas, right? Is that to say correctly? Great. Can you share examples of how AI has improved healthcare outcomes and what governance measures are essential to ensure these results in the future? Can such governance be established internationally?
So I'll start with just healthcare in general, which of all the different sectors thinking about AI right now is lagging severely. And a big part of that is because of the risk with patients and the unknown. A lot of healthcare tends to be kind of in that clinical bucket versus more operational bucket. And so when we think about governance and we think about how are we structuring not only our teams and our leadership for this type of assessment, we can bring people into a room and say, hey, look at this vendor. Do you think it's interesting? And do you see value? And if I'm a great storyteller, I can convince you that there's value. But what you do when I leave and how that kind of impacts your organization is going to depend on your team's ability to actually assess it from many different lenses. There's clinical, operational, financial outcomes. So when we think about common uses of AI, when it comes to outcomes, we really think about imaging and the ability to kind of get that negative predictability on reading kind of CT scans. We're seeing a lot of this in oncology right now. When we think about actual decision making, a lot of this, interestingly, but not because that's the spirit of healthcare, is homegrown pilots. So we're seeing those innovative institutes that are saying, hey, we need to get ahead of this because we're really behind. And they're looking at how can we predict or how can we use patient variables to try to build predictive models. Again, when we think about that, depending on the region, and we're going to talk about the United States first, if you're on the West Coast, the East Coast, if you're North, if you're South, your patient population is going to look very different. And so if I build a predictive model for sepsis post-op, right, how if a patient's going to get a really bad infection after their operation, and I'm looking at a pool of a certain type of patient demographic, and I try to apply that algorithm to a totally different patient demographic, there is an unknown outcome that is going to happen. And so there was a publication that kind of came out that made everybody sort of panic. And so part of that thought is, if you use static data, your model, it will ultimately collapse. So there is a need for real patient data. And then also the FDA and other regulatory bodies are now thinking critically about, well, we have robotics, we have other devices, there's approval processes for medications and other things we use. What is the approval process going to look like for these algorithms in the future? And so there's market hesitancy right now of how do we get in? Are we going to start our own pilots? There's a lot of vendors from just a sustainability perspective. Every hospital cannot build their own solution. So there is going to be this need for what I would almost call like our core solution that then gets customized to the environment of the hospital. And so when thinking about governance, kind of taking it back and understanding the complexity there, governance comes down to how is your organization structured? What problem are you trying to solve? Do you have the right people? What is the maturity of the organization? I can apply an advanced algorithm, and if your base electronic health record is not optimized yet, you're not going to get the value that you think you will. And so I think that the governance really needs to span the small all the way up to kind of that big vision, but there needs to be that initial kind of pilot assessment, and then kind of vendor selection, thinking about like formal RFPs or like a review for, is this going to be a solution that's going to provide us the value we think? So I think governance comes into play there, but it also comes into play post. So are we teaching the algorithm when it's not doing something right? Who is monitoring that? Where does quality, medication safety, patient safety come into play? What is the transparency if the algorithm made a mistake to the patient and the responsibility there? How do we create structures in place to educate patients on what we are using or leveraging models to do, especially when it comes to clinical decision making? And so if we're using kind of a bot in the background to kind of help with financial clearance, the patient is a little bit more accepting of that. If we're now saying, no, it's going to monitor all of your labs and your telemetry, and it's going to tell us if we think something is going to happen to you, or it's going to suggest a modification to your treatment, if that goes wrong or when that goes wrong, how do you then have that conversation with the patient? So I think there's a lot of liability, and in healthcare we always talk about like these big root causes analyses for these big events that happen, sentinel events in healthcare is what we would call them. The biggest sentinel event in AI has not yet happened, and so I think there's this like kind of pause and waiting of when will that occur, what will that look like, and how are we going to react to it? So I think healthcare being behind is very elementary, and so when we talk with clients, when we're kind of looking around the country to see what people are doing, people are aware, they understand the framework, they understand how it could be helpful, but we haven't yet thought about how are we going to structure ourselves to actually implement and make this a reality, and what are our tracking steps. So I think our governance, when I think of healthcare, is very behind. And we are now starting, those publications some of them have been out, but we're now really seeing people starting to say, okay, well, what is our CIO's role? How does that include in the job description, the AI responsibility, governance responsibilities there as well? And your last question was around kind of the international sphere for healthcare. So if we zoom out past the United States, we know we have our regulatory frameworks. So when I think about problem solving, it's really like, what is the almost jungle gym that I'm playing in? If I need to get from point A to point B and I have slides or kind of monkey bars or a crazy path on the road, how am I going to navigate? And that's really the framework in which you are problem solving. If you go to the European market, if you go to the Middle Eastern market, there are different incentives around how the government and how that the payment or funds flow kind of dictate how people are going to react. And there's also different palatability or people's ability to say, you know what, we're ready to give this a try. And so we see the Middle East right now, they love to test out robotics, and they want the new innovations, they want to learn about this. The European market is more around kind of drug shortage management in healthcare. So it really comes down to understanding the framework, and then based on that, that kind of helps you understand this is where this regional healthcare market is trending. And so how can we, based on what they're trying to accomplish, help them structure their governance appropriately to get them there? Because that's going to vary based on the organization that you're with and then the region and location internationally.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I do have some also follow-up questions, but I'll hold off. We have 5 minutes, so I really would open it up to the audience if there's a question from the audience that we'd like to pose to our panelists here. Oh, no questions? Well, then that means you get one from me. Very good. You've already touched a little bit also on education, and we do have many students here in the audience. And so I'd also like to keep in mind the kinds of students who aren't necessarily quantitatively or business gifted, right? When we think about this next question. What are the biggest challenges you anticipate students who are graduating today they will face in the context of AI and data governance? And how can we prepare them? Well, we've talked about, again, some workshops and so forth, but any other ideas, or would you like to expand on those ideas?
I'll kick us off.
Great.
I think that understanding human augmentation. So as AI comes out, there's a lot of talk about, oh, this is going to take away my job and now I have no job. And what we fail to realize is that we are implementing a solution that we now need to make sure is doing what we think it's doing. And so my job has changed and maybe it displaced my function. But as you start to get into the workforce, maybe you are not the content creator or writing the algorithms or kind of thinking through these solutions, but you are going to have creativity and adaptability to say, okay, how do I interact and where is my value? Because the human augmentation piece, there indefinitely is value to the person kind of interacting. And there's also literature to say that human augmentation is much more efficacious than just implementing AI alone. So how do we think through what that looks like? And I think that will definitely be a challenge or kind of call as you're all graduating and going into your various industries is where do these solutions come into play? What function are they taking over? And because of that, now how do I change my context of thinking of this so that I can now pair to make this a little bit more valuable?
I would just say I teach a class here, but certainly not as much as Dr. Dean there in the back. But we have talked about trying to incorporate more AI like tools and just getting students more comfortable. I think that's happening. I think we, along with a lot of other places I'm aware of, at first when ChatGPT came out, it's like everybody's going to cheat. Well, now it's like, well, let's how can we use this? How can we incorporate this? I think in my brief little experiment with it in my own class, it seems to engage students to get, and they seem to enjoy it. So it's an opportunity that I think a lot of folks here and at other universities around the country and the world too, I think we'll seize to try to get students more exposed and more comfortable. We certainly are. I don't think it's feasible to expose them to every possible tool in that they're going to encounter, but I think we can start to build that exposure and start to grow students to where they can do what you're saying, to be able to really think about the problem in the context which they're trying to solve it and use the right tool for the right problem.
Excellent. I agree totally.
I think both those are absolutely correct. I'd also say that 20 years ago we couldn't have predicted half the jobs that we have right now, and I think right now we probably can't predict half the jobs that we'll see in 10 years, right? So I think this is one of these things that you get a little bit of an exponential growth. And so what we need to do is help our students be resilient and help them to be creative problem solvers. And we see this exact same thing in the cybersecurity space, right? The cybersecurity space moves very quickly. There's a certain level of base knowledge that you need to have. There's certain basic blocking and tackling of IT security that people need to understand to be successful. But really, they need to be creative problem solvers. And to the extent that we can teach that to people, that's, I think, what we need to be doing.
I'll add one more thing to the problem solving. That's where I got excited. In one of my introductory classes, I really hone in on thinking critically, right? Really, what are you bringing to the table? What are the kinds of data that are available to you? What are the subsequent implications? So whether it's adaptability or problem solving or solutions. So good job. Thanks for reinforcing my class on that. All right, with that, it is exactly 3 p.m. So thank you so much for attending our panel. Do you have any further announcements to make?
I'll just make a quick one. We're going to take about a 5-minute break, and I also think let's give our panel a hand. This was a very informative and exciting discussion. Thank you. So we'll come back here at 3:05 for a discussion on data-driven decisions for regional impact, featuring some of our regional leaders. So we'll see you soon.